All right, let's start. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another webinar in the new War and Peace series that we are trying to host every month now since January 2021. Today's topic is quite dear to my heart. It's effectively a critique of history education, which I personally long believe that has a major impact on the Armenian and Azerbaijan relationship and overall practically every conflict in our region and beyond. And it's dear to me also because I personally also worked over 10 years on this topic, that written extensively criticizing our history textbooks for promoting enemy image and really not allowing us to move forward, trying to propose alternatives. But also after 10 years got quite disappointed in trying to work on this, because any attempt, even the smallest ones, even the smallest critique, was leading to such a backlash, and people who were trying to do the work were, getting problems at work and so on. So it felt like it's futile. But I'm very hopeful and happy to see that there are others that picked up this topic, and the two of our panelists today are a generation younger than me and my colleague Sergey Rumyansev, who will be moderating today's session, and are also not letting essentially this drop and really pushing this conversation forward, which is extremely important because, as we'll see today, and I think a lot of you who are signed up hopefully have noticed, the history, the way we teach it, the way we talk about it is very foundational block to our conflicts and our inability to solve them. So this is a short introduction to the topic from me. I'm Philip Gamagelian. I'm one of the editors of Caucasus Edition and one of the co-hosts of this series of webinars. Today's webinar will be moderated by my good colleague and friend Sergey Rumyansev, who is also an editor at Caucasus Edition and a researcher at the Center for Independent Studies in Berlin. And today's panelists are Mirkamran Huseynli, who is, briefly to introduce, an independent researcher and lecturer in nationalism studies, political theory, comparative history, and area studies focusing on East Central Europe and Caucasus. And feel free to introduce yourself longer, Mirkamran, if you'd like. And Flora Ghazaryan, with a PhD candidate at the Central European University in the Department of Comparative History. Before turning over to Sergey for moderation, let me give you a couple of words about the format. So since we have two panelists, our webinar will last an hour, about 60 minutes. So 56 from now on. For the first 40 minutes, Sergey will moderate a discussion with Mirkamran and Flora. And after that, we will turn to Q&A, to question and answers from the audience. So if you have questions, feel free to post them by clicking the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen, or if for some reason that's not accessible, or if you'd like to post a comment rather than question, press the chat button. And you can post it there and we all can see that. And we can post it anytime, and I'll be collecting the questions. And for the final 20 minutes, I'll try to get through as many of them as possible. I apologize in advance if we don't get through all of them. So thank you. And with that, Sergey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phil, for your introduction. And I want to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. Thank you, Flora and Mirkamran. And we will be discussing a topic that, well, in a few words, maybe can be represented like the teaching of national history in the secondary school and history textbooks in the situation of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So why the topic is so important for us? To answer to that question, maybe I switch very shortly to another hot conflict and war in Ukraine. And anyone who observes these events may know how much attention the political regime in Russia gave to the school already during the hostilities, A special lesson was devised to explain the school children why Russia began a military invasion of a neighboring state. It was during the war, during this last months, when in Russia that discussions about how history would be taught in schools began and continue unabated. In Ukraine, the teaching of national history and the content of textbooks is treated, I think, with no less attention. So this example, as well as that of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, demonstrates that secondary school remains the most important institution for educating patriots. In a situation of armed conflict, such education inevitably, what I think, takes militaristic features. Or in other words, in many post-Soviet countries, the secondary school remains the most important institution for fostering militaristic patriotism. Often schools are a space for propaganda of enemy images. It is the school that prepares the conditions for the mobilization of the population, preparing new generations for wars and participation in armed conflicts. So many researchers in different countries talk about this. For example, researchers in the United States. So in Azerbaijani Armenian case, I think we're unfortunately not talking about the exception to the rule. In many other countries, the situation looks very similar. But of course, every case has its own specifics and its own characteristics or differences. And it should be emphasized, I want to emphasize that the national history course plays a special role. Therefore, it is very important to study the content of textbooks also. The educational narrative can tell us a lot about official nationalist ideologies, I think. So the role that a national history textbook plays in a conflict situation is what we are going to talk about today. And it is with my great pleasure that I pass to our speakers, and I began with the question. My first question will be, so before we turn specifically to the history textbooks of Azerbaijan and the Armenian people, maybe we'll talk a little more broadly about the teaching of national history. So what are the specifics of this subject? What ideas are usually reflected in the history textbooks? What is the purpose of teaching national history in general? And how and what explains the need for such a subject at school? So who start? Maybe Mirkamran or Flora? You decide. The floor is yours.
I think Mirkamran can start and then I will go on.
All right. So if we look at it, broadly as a national history, like if you look at the term national history, I think we have to first look at the first word of this term, the national part, which is the main part of our critique in this webinar, right? So we are not here to debate history, but rather national history as a subject, because I would distinguish between the two. National history as a subject, it was historically simply meant to serve nation building of different nation states. And we know that since the French Revolution, masses started becoming politicized, and therefore the tendency in the Western world had been to nationalize dynastic empires and turn them into nation states, where the source of legitimacy would be people rather than a monarch, right? And that's why national curriculum was introduced to create that people throughout the 19th century, where the teaching of social studies and humanities equally became nationalized, where we started seeing national history, national geography, national language, national literature, national arts, and etc. That's the tendency which started in the 19th century. And by the way, this tendency still carries on because political theorists still couldn't devise a framework that would transform from national identity towards transnational model of citizenship or transnational curriculum along with it. So this still continues on, but the difference between 19th century national history curriculum and 21st century national history curriculum in the Western world, I would say, is in 19th century, national history curriculum was rather hugely ethnocentric in most of the polities. But in 21st century, we see a change where civic, in 21st century, in the Western liberal democracies, civic nation building models started to dominate national curriculum and then national discourse, where not only proper groups, proper ethnic groups were represented in the national history, but also other groups such as migrants, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, all of them were represented, and all of them were regarded as part of the nation and national history. That is the tendency we've seen in 21st century liberal democracies. For example, unlike 19th century national histories, where national enemy identities were exploited in order to empower social cohesion and national unity. For example, we can see that in Bismarck's Germany, where Reichsfeinde identity was used against French in order to bolster German national identity in German Empire. And we all know how these enemy identities in German Reichsfeinde, how these enemy identities turned out. It led to 2 world wars. It led to genocide of 6 million Jews, destruction of entire continental Europe. And that's why liberal democracies of 21st century started changing the national history curriculum by making it more inclusive and less hostile, especially less hostile towards outgroup societies. And that's why we don't see national rivalry between, it's part of the reason we don't see national rivalry between German and French in contemporary world, but we see the contrary effect, where the 2 societies created fraternal, good neighborly coexistence and cooperation. When it comes to 21st century Armenia and Azerbaijan, especially looking at their history education, we can note that their history curriculum is still heavily ethnocentric. It tends to construct enemy identity that serves to ethnic rivalry and ethnic hostility towards that constructed enemy. So we still see these 19th century European models of national curriculum that persists in Azerbaijani and Armenian history textbooks and all of the national curriculum. And history proved us that this form of nation building model, this form of national curriculum model, neither serves to long-term national unity within the society itself, nor does it serve interethnic and neighborly coexistence between the 2 neighboring societies. And that's the part of the problem we see right now in Armenian and Azerbaijani societies and their national curriculum. But in general, the reason why, the specifics of this subject, the national history textbooks, the reason it exists right now is to serve to the national cohesion within the society, but also to serve to the peaceful coexistence between the interethnic and international groups, between 2 neighborly groups. Right now in Azerbaijan and Armenian case, the national history curriculum fails to serve to that purpose. That's all I can say at the moment about national history and what it serves for.
Thank you, Mirkamran and Flora.
Yeah, I will take a different turn to this because Mirkamran covered mostly all the historical part of the origin of national history as a national. But I think the other aspect that we need to look here is, and I'm going to heavily compare Armenia and Azerbaijan, the post-Soviet countries, with the post-Yugoslav countries. And if we can take this symbolic comparison or understanding, we are the nation states who are right now, if we will compare it to the human, we are in the stage of puberty or teenager. So we are in the search of identity, and this is also going with Serbia, with Macedonia, especially all these post-Yugoslav countries who came to existence out of nowhere. Those countries who didn't have the strong kingdom, a strong empire, or a strong union. So we, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and all the post-Yugoslav and post-Soviet countries, we came to an existence not understanding what we are, where we are, and how we are going to position ourselves within the world history, where we are. And I think this is the urge and the need that, especially in the post-Soviet history writing, we can see this tendency that the ethnocentric and nationalistic one, because you need to justify your existence, and justifying your existence always going with like we and the others. And this is the failing aspect of all of these history writings and history teaching, because there is always the other against which we need to identify ourselves. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. This is why we have the need for such a subject in the schools, especially in the post-Soviet and post-Yugoslav period. This is the purpose of national history teaching, to pass these like young nation states through their teenager period to become an adult who is self-aware about their own existence. But unfortunately, we are now in this stage, and this is exactly what me and Mirkamran and also you, when you were writing your research, we're trying to actually highlight and identify that this period, this phase that we are now existing in needs to shift, because there is no such a need right now in the 21st century as a country, not as a person. Like, and here the comparison of a person and young nation state is ending. There is no need to contradict and like to put an other in front of you to justify your existence. And this is actually what we extensively wrote also in our article, when we are saying that the historical background and the understanding should stop like from the empirical, this perennialist and primordialist understanding, and start with the idea of modernization, so the nation state and onwards. And I think, yeah, not just to run over the time, I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Flora. Well, we started to talk about specifically Azerbaijani and Armenian textbooks and curricula, but let us go a little bit closer, and maybe what can you say about, but please don't forget that we are talking about the history textbook in the context of the Karabakh conflict, and bearing in mind this context, in your view, what goals did the authors of the textbooks set for themselves, and how were these goals or objectives reflected in the texts, in the narratives? Maybe Flora, you start now.
Yeah, I can start. So thank you for bringing us to this question, because this is the thing that we see over and over and again after each and every edition that is coming of Armenian and Azerbaijani history textbooks. And this was highlighted. The term Qarabaghization is already in existence. So we need to understand that each and every historical narrative, be it before the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, be it after that. So the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan is heavily dependent right now on the Karabakh war and the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And this is exactly where the history textbooks are standing. And also the language, if you are looking in many, so first time actually Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis as an ethnicity is mentioned when we are speaking about the First Republic, with a disclaimer that it's a Muslim republic, which is the first time is using the province of Iran, Azerbaijan as a name. So there is already, like, you know, with this disclaimer, you are already coming to this Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, already highlighting which country should be older and which country, like, you know, was there before the other one is coming. And this is the point. We have these disclaimers, we have all of this language throughout. And if you are looking before the First Republic period, and this was what was shocking for me, that you don't find the name Azerbaijani as an ethnicity, as a country. You have the local Muslims. Muslim. So there is no explanation. There is always the question of claims, territorial claims, but there is no justification or there is no questioning. So we are having this heavy ideology, and I don't like to use the ideology or propaganda words, but there is this, like, you know, template stone. This is the reality, and there is no questioning afterwards of that. You have this sentence, this narrative, and there is no changing between these two. But you don't understand where these people come from, and this is coming from the standpoint that we're talking only like Armenians and the window to the world. Let's see what is happening. But the countries, the hostile countries that are surrounding us, we are not going to look on their history throughout the centuries, but we are going to focus only on the part of the history that they played as a conflict with us. So there is no coexistence, there is no understanding where Azerbaijanis are coming from, how the country was formed, what is the culture, what was the coexistence, what we took from each other. This is only the context of a war, and there is nothing else apart from the war. Even if you are looking on the sections of these history textbooks, you can see that the Armenian-Georgian relations will be the international relations of the First Republic of Armenia, but Armenia and Azerbaijan will be in the section which is the external threats to Armenia, and this is always linked. Armenia and Azerbaijan and Turkey are always linked to each other, and maybe we can discuss about this issue of connectivity of the neighboring countries separately. But what I just want to say that Karabakhization is heavily playing a role in the understanding and in the writing of the role of Azerbaijanis in the Armenian history, let's say, and the history of the region in particular.
Kamran?
I agree with Flora's. But the idea is the goal of the authors usually reflect the position of the political establishment, right? As we mentioned in our article, Armenian and Azerbaijani history textbooks, it underwent several curricular changes over the past 100 years. For example, when we look at the Soviet times, for example, in the Soviet times, the Armenian and Azerbaijani history textbooks, the national history textbooks, were heavily influenced by ideology of the Bolshevik ideology, in that respect, all the national intelligentsia of the First Republic were labeled as bourgeoisie exploiters, and the focus of attention was given to rivalry between the classes, like working class and the bourgeoisie exploiters. Yet, after the dissolution of Soviet Union and the establishment of independent Armenia and Azerbaijan, these narratives were reversed, this time along ethnic and national lines, as Flora has mentioned. And this time, the focus of attention turned to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict due to the ongoing war in Nagorno-Karabakh region in the 90s. This tendency is called Karabakhization of national history, which is the same tendency not only in Armenia, but also in Azerbaijan history textbooks. Both history textbooks heavily centered around Karabakh conflict. And that's why we can see that the goal that was set in the Armenian Azerbaijan history textbook since the 90s, number one goal is to nationalize national history, as Rogers Brubaker would call it, nationalizing nationalism. This is number one goal. Number two goal, as Flora has mentioned, to Karabakhize national history and to put the focus of attention to Karabakh region, to make sure that it is represented as the cradle of Armenian/Azerbaijani civilization. Both of them has the same tendency of looking at Karabakh as the region. And the third tendency is to construct an enemy identity where all the misgivings of national could be blamed on that enemy. That's what I see, particularly on Azerbaijani history textbooks. So these three are the goals that was set by the authors. And of course, these goals are definitely heavily influenced by the ideologies of the ruling political establishments. That is the part of the problem that we are facing with the Azerbaijani and Armenian history textbooks currently.
Thank you, Mirkamran. Karabakhization, conflict, and this is like inevitably appeared enemy images in the textbook specifically. So what do you think, how is the collective image of Azerbaijanis presented in Armenian textbooks, and on the contrary, the collective image of Armenians in Azerbaijani textbooks? So who wants to start? Flora, please.
Yeah, I can start. So the enemy image, and I will speak only about Armenian textbooks and the representation, the creation of Azerbaijani enemy image in the Armenian history textbooks. So first of all, we need to understand that this is heavily linked to Armenian genocide and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And there is always this link. Each and every chapter you are going to look in the Armenian history textbooks, it's always the link with the Ottoman Empire or the Turkish Republic and Azerbaijan. Turkish Republic was supporting with money, local Azerbaijanis were supporting with weapons, etc., etc., etc. So this is all in harmony, and harmonically, this is connected. So the Azerbaijani enemy image is connected with the understanding that these are Turkic tribes, so they are Turks. Even in the outside of the Turkish textbooks, you can always see that the regular Armenian people will also compare Azerbaijanis are the same as Turks. So this identity is already created, this like, global enemy image of a Turkic nation like the Great Turan, which is threatening Armenia from both sides. And this is reflected also in the history textbooks with this like line of everywhere there is an Azerbaijan and there is the Turkish issue coming together. The other issue, how the image of enemy is created, is actually what we did, the comparison of the first three republics, the war between Armenia and Georgia and the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Even qualitatively and quantitatively, when you are looking the space that is given to each and every conflict, Georgia is always 50% less. The Armenian-Georgian conflict is 50% less. There are less negative adjectives attached to Georgia and Georgians and Georgia as such, even though there is a discussion of the war. Whereas on the contrary to this, we have always with the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflicts, it's always massacres, violence, slaughters, bloodthirsty enemies, contradicting to the part where there is a violence by the Armenians organized against the Azerbaijanis, be it the Baku pogroms, be it the Zangi-Basar, Olti, Artashat, Nakhichevan regions. It's always called the pacification of the region, of the local Muslims. So, and this, even the pacification of the local Muslims is always connected with the issue of Turkey. So Turkey supporting and pushing the local Muslims to go against the Armenians. And this is creating actually the enemy image. And this is I keep always saying the pillars of Armenian national identity is the Armenian genocide, and now also the Karabakh conflict. And so not surprisingly, these two issues and these two countries and these two ethnicities are connected each other to create even more stronger understanding of this big enemy image from both sides of Armenia. And I think Kamran will take us to the Armenian image.
Thank you, Flora. The same applies to Azerbaijani history textbooks. They kind of mirror each other, I would say. But the certain like specificities of Azerbaijani history textbooks is the collective image of Armenians are depicted, I would say, with a priori nature. For example, the nature of interethnic relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis described as if there had always been this interethnic hostility between the two societies since the period of antiquity all the way to the Middle Ages and contemporary period. And as Flora said, epithets that are used in history textbook also refers to, like it has this negative nature, and particularly in Azerbaijani history textbooks, the epithets refer to the existing inherent hate towards one another, especially Armenian inherent hate towards Azerbaijanis. For example, when describing 1905 or 1918 clashes between Armenian and Azerbaijani communities, Armenians are described as people who are essentially hateful toward Azerbaijanis and whose sole aim is to cleanse native Azerbaijani population from their native lands in order to forge its own state in this land. And I would say, last but not least, the most striking part of this national discourse against Armenians in Azerbaijani history textbooks, I think, is the matter of indigeneity. Armenians they are described as a group who were not indigenous to the Caucasus region at all, and they were moved to the region by the Russian Empire in later period of 18th and 19th centuries for Russian imperialistic purposes. This is the most striking part for me as a young historian, I would say. And of course, all these either representations and interpretations of region's history in both of the history textbooks, I mean, all of them are, historically inaccurate, and they do not reflect the reality. So this form of representations, be it a priori enemy image, be it discourse of Armenians being latecomers to the region, be it so-called inherent Armenian hatred towards Azerbaijanis, all of them are intended to serve the essentialist nature of so-called Armenian virtue in their relation towards Azerbaijanis. And it also feeds to and reiterates this Azerbaijani belief that Armenians are not native to the region and they are latecomers. They don't have, they don't have the legitimate claim to any of the lands they own or any of the lands they claim to own. So that's how the collective enemy image is is constructed in the Azerbaijani history textbooks. And the main reason for such a constructed enemy image is simply to delegitimize the other side's claim to the land, be it the land they own or be it the land they claim to own. So this is how the enemy image is created since the 90s, and it still carries on. And by the way, I looked at the previous editions, like the editions in 90s and the 2000s. There are not much changes with regards to conceptual, matters, like in terms of the image of the Armenians in the history textbook. So the revised editions are the same. I know that Sergey and Phil has worked on the 2010 or early 2000 editions, but the latest editions of Azerbaijani history textbooks, they are the same. It's just structurally certain changes, but the rest of them stays the same.
Same for the Armenian ones, actually. We went through all of them, so heavily relied on your research. There was Satanik Mukherchan's research for the last Soviet and early post-Soviet textbooks, and we compared the recent ones that came out a couple of years ago. So the structural narrative is exactly the same. There are slight changes, but the let's say the idea that they want to transfer to the young generation, to people who are going to read these textbooks, is exactly the same throughout these last 30 years.
And a very short, quick question. So the first new post-Soviet history textbooks first appeared in 19th, yeah? Both in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So just maybe I ask you with my next question to add a couple of words about enemy images. Flora, you mentioned already Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Turks, Mirkamran, you mentioned Russia and Russians. So let's say that this type of images, they're often multi-component images. So what are the imagined communities, let's say, what other nations, maybe neighbors, are represented as hostile in textbooks? What are the specifics of the discourse of enmity? Maybe you can add something to that. So for instance, Iran, how Iran represented. Georgia, you mentioned also Georgia, maybe a couple of more words about that.
Yeah, so maybe I will start and then Kamran will take over, as this is the order that we got with. When I was looking on the image of neighbors, in our research, I tried to see what is the national security strategy of Armenia. And this was the last one updated, I think it was June or July 2020. So interestingly, the language was very much in the harmony with the national security strategy of the country. So let's say there are mentioning, of course, in the 6th grade and the 7th grade history textbooks about Shah Abbas moving Armenians from Julfa to New Julfa, etc., and how many Armenians died there. But there is not that much of a negative language attached to all of this, let's say, violence. I don't want to use the word massacre, which sometimes is used also even in the university textbooks about the Shah Abbas moving Armenians there, merchants. But this violence is not really highlighted that much, and this can be an excuse for some to say, well, it happened in the 17th century, it's not that early. But when we are referring to the hate towards Armenians and Turks, towards Armenians and Azerbaijanis, this is also stretching over the centuries, right? But the national security strategy and the relations of Armenia and Iran changed. So Iran is described as a neighborly, friendly country. So we can see in the history textbooks that the violence that happened between Armenians and Iranians is somewhat overlooked. There is a mentioning of big events of what happened, but the negative adjectives are completely removed from there. The same as I mentioned with Georgia. It has 50% less of a space, the conflict between Armenians and Georgians, than the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and this is only for the first republics of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. And with the rest of the narrative, when you're looking on the Armenian Georgian issues, of course, there are like back and forth, this, especially in the medieval period, who was building what, was there Queen Tamar, or there were Armenian royal families who were ruling Georgia, etc. These kind of debates, but there is not such a negative adjective, like the negative feeling is not attached. Again, when you are looking on the national security strategy, you can see Georgia, friendly neighboring country. When you are going to Armenia, to Azerbaijan and Turkey, you can see that as the Turkey. First of all, there is a mentioning Turkey, and along with Turkey, Azerbaijan. So there is always this, like, one step down, forever ally of Turkey, which is Azerbaijan. And the same narrative goes with both of them, because they trade the national security of Armenia, etc., 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 with deportations, etc., and massacres. And this language is translating the threat of deportation and massacre is directly translated into history textbooks with both of the countries. And I think the other biggest player in the region is Russia, as we already mentioned. And with Russia, again, I didn't see that much of a negative characteristic add to that. The only shift which was happening, and we were again mentioning the last Soviet and the early 90s First Republic, Third Republic history textbooks, the shift is only on the understanding of the national heroes. So the national heroes of the First Republican time of Armenia, they were characterized as the anti-Bolsheviks, the negative characters throughout the Soviet time period. When the Third Republic of Armenia was founded, there was the shift. So these people, the persona non gratas, became the national heroes. And then the friendly Soviet understanding of people shifted. And the idea came not as much as I think in Azerbaijani textbooks, and the Azerbaijani understanding of occupational period, Soviet occupational period, is a little bit heavier than the Armenian one. However, there was a shift when all of these people who went against the Soviet Union, against the Bolsheviks in the First Republican period, they all became national heroes. But again, there is not any heavy, visible negative connotation on Russia also. And I think I will finish here.
Thank you. Mirkamran?
I think, as already Flora mentioned, I would say there is, since our study of Armenian Azerbaijani history textbooks, you guys, we have seen that the national history in both history textbooks follow an anachronistic pattern. For instance, despite the fact that Armenian Azerbaijan conflict, it doesn't go beyond last 100 years, which means that there's no record of any intercommunal enmity between the two societies, be it in Middle Ages, be it in the Antiquity. But both history textbooks anachronistically interpret the past events of Antiquity and Middle Ages from the lens of contemporary identity politics. The same applies to other neighboring polities. It applies in Azerbaijan textbooks to the Russian or Persian dynasties. So they are also portrayed in Azerbaijan history textbooks from the lens of contemporary identity politics. But the particular attention has been given, when it is this, for example, when Russians or Russian Tsarist Russia is described, or when Persian dynasties are described, the role of these neighboring polities were interpreted from the perspective of Armenian-Azerbaijan rivalry, rather than interpreting or putting any negative enemy image to those neighboring communities. They were portrayed as rather moderators or as third parties who played a role within Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict and in this context of rivalry. That is how it is described. So this anachronism, even though, for example, in 17th and 18th century, there was no the same identity politics that it exists right now. But 17th and 18th century Tsarist Russia is portrayed as a polity who wished to settle Armenians between Azerbaijan and Ottoman Empire in order to divide two brotherly nations, for instance. But we know that in 17th and 18th centuries, these centuries are still the period of religious sectarian identity rather than ethnic and national, So this kind of anachronistic interpretation of the history applies to the neighboring communities as well. And it is, as Flora has mentioned, it follows the national security strategy. So the history textbooks, be it representation of the, let's say, hostile or rival neighbor, or be it a neutral neighbor, all of them follow today's foreign policy or today's national security strategy of Azerbaijan. And the same as Flora has mentioned, it's the same in the Armenian history textbooks, where they follow what their national security strategy tell us to follow. And the epithets are the same exactly as it is in the national strategy security. The same epithets are used in the history textbooks. In the Middle Ages, the Antiquity dynasties of those neighbors, the same epithets are used in order to reflect to the contemporary politics, contemporary identity politics.
Thank you. And My final question is what to do with such textbooks if we talk about peaceful transformation of conflicts. So what possibilities, approaches, I don't know, perhaps ready-made successful recipes for changing textbooks, you know, or what formats for historians to work together. And do we have in Armenia and Azerbaijan such resources for in-depth reconstruction of textbooks narrative? I know it's quite a difficult question, but maybe you can both shortly, very quickly answer to that. Thank you.
Maybe I can start shortly and Flora might elaborate more on. Shortly, what I can say is that we have already written in our article that we all know that it's highly unlikely that both of the nation states would voluntarily change their national standards for textbook writing in the near future. And we know that any kind of proposed change that we can make to the ministries of education in both countries, they won't make up to the end, or they won't be accepted. And that's why in our article, Flora and I suggested creating alternative textbooks that comes as the most possible outcome, along with those of the approved versions by the respective states of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And how do we disseminate these, these alternative textbooks? We came up with the idea that we can disseminate it by using civil society or NGO, or for example, there are various social media initiatives, Bright Guardian Voices or Caucasus Crossroads, that is on Facebook, or Caucasus Talks, the one that Flora and I are part of, have been part of. So these can be the starting platforms that we have in our mind. Or there are a lot of civil society media initiatives. We can raise awareness by using these initiatives amongst the younger generation through postcards, webinars like the one that we are doing right now. Inform them about the ways history textbooks are instrumented, or the ends these textbooks serve, or how desperate we are for the alternative history textbooks in this post-conflict situation. So these are the ways that we can kind of propose our ideas of alternative view towards the Armenian Azerbaijan national history. And that's the way I do see that we can disseminate, knowing that in the schools, secondary schools, they won't be allowed to be used as a curriculum. So that's why the civil society is one of the ways that we can use to disseminate those textbooks. What do you think, Flora?
I agree with you. I agree with you that this is mainly civil society, because regardless of, we have been on a different workshop, me and Kamran, both of us, and we were hearing from our colleagues, because I don't live in Armenia for a while now, and I don't know what is the modern, current changes that are happening in the Ministry of Education. And I heard from some of the colleagues that there are attempts to change something. However, regardless of how much there are attempts, I don't feel that these attempts are going to go into the final stage, which is the rewriting the history and removing completely this understanding of an enemy image. There can be a little bit negotiation, so it's going to be a tiny, tiny window opening to the possibility, even with these changes. But I don't think that the way how the textbooks are structured and the main goal that they are serving to is going to be changed unless we change actually the national security strategy. And why I was speaking about this and why Kamran was mentioning, because we see that this is a very pyramid organization where there is the national interest, there is the Ministry of Education, there is this there are the how you call this, the needs, the requirements for the history textbooks. So unless the very top of the interest of the country is not changing, all of these requirements in the Ministry of Education are not going to change. So it's gonna be a little bit to you, a little bit to me negotiations. So it's not the change that we want to have. And as Kamran also said, the only way now that we see, and we were playing with different scenarios, how this can happen before we actually wrote our recommendation part in the article, is that the civil society, both in our countries should work together, and also civil society outside. So we also, as members of a local civil society, need to reach out to bigger organizations to make sure that these bigger organizations who have bigger audience are going to make sure that this voice, these ideas are heard, the questioning even of the fact that these two communities possibly were coexisting more than they had conflict at some point is going to change the narrative. So yes, there is a need, and there was also a discussion, maybe we don't actually need textbooks, because in the 21st century, textbook is not the only media of educating people. However, still, there has to be a written standard textbook, especially when we are speaking about the bachelor level and the school level students. No matter how much you are going to use the modern technologies, there still need to be a textbooks which they are going to follow with their photographic memory to see, to read this one tiny paragraph and to understand what's going to be there. So the idea is to change the narrative, and changing the narrative is always coming with the approved textbook, which we are not going to get in our case. So when we are not going to get the approved changed history textbook, the other way is the alternative textbook, which is going to be there, existing there. And through social media, we're going to raise the curiosity, awareness, and interest of people. Let me go and open that other book that is like, forbidden, let's say, even in the countries, because I assume that this is not going to come, even if it's published with bravos in both of the countries. So it's gonna be something that, like, very interesting, very, very forbidden fruits we're laying there. But if we are going to make sure that even not forcing to change the understanding of people of other generation, but actually raising curiosity that there can be a different side of this coin that you were learning about. Just go and read for yourself, ask the question for yourself, not listen and repeat what I'm saying, but ask questions for yourself, go read different narrative and make up your mind. I think this is the way how this is going to change. And then when there is enough of an audience that we have, this is going to create a demand. And at some point, maybe, hopefully, our countries will actually, the top is going to shift because the demand is going to be way bigger than it is now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now I think maybe Phil continues with the questions or comments from the audience, and maybe from your side also. Thank you, Flora. Thank you, Mirkamran.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, Flora. Thank you, Mirkamran. And Sergey, maybe I'll ask you also to potentially participate a little bit in the following discussion, because as Flora and Mirkamran also mentioned, you and I also have done some work in this respect. Also, I want to open up to the audience, and we have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. Comments are more just thanking you for your work. But in terms of questions, we don't have that many. So I'm reminding the audience that there is a chance to post questions that we would take on. So feel free to bring them up. I'll start actually from the last question that was posted, because I don't fully understand it. The question is about positioning of Armenian and Azerbaijani national histories in the context of wider regional history. So if possible, the person who asked the question, could you please clarify, are you interested in how are Armenians and Azerbaijanis represented in other national histories, or how are they represented in their own, in Armenian and Azerbaijani textbooks vis-a-vis other nations? This is where I'm not sure. So this is a question to the person who asked the question for now. You don't need to answer yet. But I'll go to the first question, and this one was about any changes that happened in the last 3 years on behalf of the governments. And I think you already answered that indirectly by saying essentially that there were no changes in Azerbaijani and the textbooks are very similar to what we've seen in 2000s and 2010s. And Flora, I think you also said a similar thing, despite kind of changes in governments a few times in Armenia, when it comes at least to the conflict history, the overall structure seemed to reproduce itself, despite a lot of actually versions. In the Armenian case, there were a few changes. So I'll try to build on this question a bit, since I also have some experience on this topic. And when we got into this work, similar to you, like about 10 years ago, there was this very interesting experience of Georgia, which in 2003, when Mikhail Saakashvili came to power, they did a really good work in terms of changing the legal landscape for it. So you were mentioning that, right now the ministries impose essentially, right, criteria and very nationalistic narratives, and then the textbooks simply reproduce them. So our assumption is that change the change can come from Ministry of Education. So they did that. They did the change from the Ministry of Education, and they actually removed the state from the equation and just let anybody to write textbooks they like, and and teachers to teach them, and so on. So it was very kind of libertarian approach to education. It didn't necessarily work very well because people weren't ready for it, right? So people were used to, for 70 years of being told what and how to teach, textbook authors, teachers, and so on. So it just created a lot of confusion, let's say, right? So what we tried to do, and then gradually it went back towards a bit more standardized version of education, but probably with some progress compared to Armenia and Azerbaijan. So when we tried to do was, okay, so maybe someday there will be political opening. So let us actually work on building these alternative textbooks, right? Alternative education methods. So when there is, or if there is ever an opening in Armenia or Azerbaijan, then hopefully we'll be more prepared than Georgians were when their political opening came. So we did quite a bit of work, and you are well aware of it, and I'm happy to post if anybody would like to see, criticizing textbooks, writing alternative textbooks, creating teacher manuals, and what else. And then the opening came. In Armenian case, in 2018, there was a revolution, and new government came in, including some people came to power who were actually similar to you, you two right now, before that, criticizing textbooks. And they tried to enact some reform. So initially there was a reform agenda put on the table. And first of all, the agenda itself was very, very minimalistic. So there was absolutely almost like, to my taste, there was almost no changing anything, right? But it was changing in terms of content. There was practically no changes to be made. But there was something to be very little. But there was important change to be made about the way the teaching happens. So it was to be less dogmatic, a bit more critical thinking oriented, let's say. And that alone was enough to solicit a major fight back from civil society. So this is where I want to question overall, your assumption that is necessarily top-down imposed problem. It is, but you remove the top, or the top tries to change things, as we saw in Georgia or in Armenia, when the Ministry of Education tries to implement reform agenda, you actually don't have necessarily support of civil society. You actually have a fight back of the civil society. In Armenian case, civil society was more the academia, essentially. So pretty much all the heads of institutes of history of practically every university in Armenia and the Academy of Sciences united to prevent any change from happening, and they succeeded. They essentially bullied the few people who were trying to enact a minimalistic reform to a point where they essentially either resigned or just weren't able to really advance much. That's why when you see the new textbooks that followed, they are pretty much replicating the old textbooks, because it was simply impossible because of the pressure from below. I mean, not below, the middle, whatever, but not necessarily from the top, right? So top wanted to change, bottom didn't. So I think this long story and why I was disappointed at some point and stepped out of this was the case. So I couldn't see any way forward here. But how would you answer to this challenge, right? So it's not necessarily only the top. It's so normalized, essentially, that even if the top wants to change, then the bottom is, the society itself actually wants to hold the ground in terms of ethnic history and kind of promotion of enemy image. They see it as a national security issue, right? So thoughts from either Sergey or two of you. Where do we go from here?
I think I will continue with the Armenian case, and then maybe let Sergey and Kamran go to Azerbaijani case. So I totally agree. I was following these issues when they happened, and also the Armenian and Turkish history textbooks, the trial, let's change the couple of schools. And I remember exactly what you said. It was not civil society / academia saying that these people are actually traitors because they are working for the Soros Foundation, the Soros spies, and the Istanbul Convention. So not understanding any of the issues that are relevant or not connected to each other. They were trying to connect everything and create a great conspiracy theory behind this, being these Armenians who are trying to change Armenian and Turkish history textbooks are actually paid by the Turkish government to write anti-Armenian history textbooks. And this was surprising because this was coming from also some of the history professors who were teaching me at Yerevan State University, and some of them whose books I also have. And so I'm not going to go to into details, but this was the reaction that was there, and I understood that this society is not ready for that. And the other situation, when I understood that this society is not ready, it was actually either last year or a year and a half ago, when the school teachers were supposed to go to an examination in Armenia, when half of the teachers who actually went, so majority of them refused to go to this examination to see what is their level, how they are, like, so with the new methods, etc., etc., etc. So first of all, majority, I guess only 1/3 of the overall teachers participated into this. Most of them failed this, and the rest of them did not participate. And the problem why I'm bringing this to you, yes, you are right. It's not only top problem. It's not only civil society problem. It's also teachers' problem, because if we have teachers who are actually in the classrooms, there is, yes, the textbooks, yes, there is the top-down implementation, but we also remember in the Soviet period, my mom worked in classrooms when there was not, when the national history was not allowed, and they were teaching them Armenian. It's a different problem, like on its own, but still, if there is a will by a teacher, they can teach whatever they want to the students. And this is not happening because we have old school, let's say, I don't want to say incompetent, but we have old school teachers who are in the age of 70 right now, sitting in the classrooms, not even knowing, especially in this pandemic, how to turn on Zoom. And they are still teaching with the Soviet understanding of how history should look like. Okay. So I think we have this 3-layered problem. And if we want the change, we also have to retrain the teachers, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sergey or Mirkamran, anything to add?
Do you want to add something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of optimistic about, about in this case, because I do see, like, Azerbaijan community to be a bit more communitarian, in a sense that there has always been, the policy have always been top down, and there have never been any kind of a backlash or any significant backlash from the society. And considering also, I would say, like, civil society itself doesn't also have that much of a voice in policy making, even though this statement is Janus-faced, because it has reverse effect to the changes we want to make with the civil society. Since civil society doesn't have that much voice, it doesn't help us either in our, like, trying to change the history textbooks to a positive direction. But from the perspective that you raised, I also do think that since everything has always been top down, and the society never gave, from what I've observed, never gave any response that could create tension within the political elite. That's why I still think that the same policies could be applied top down in Azerbaijan society, and it wouldn't make that much of a huge debate or huge tensions amongst the civil society or in the grassroots level. That's my perspective. But what do you think, Sergey?
Oh, so maybe I just go a little back. Yeah, sure. And this is not about Azerbaijan and Armenia. You told a lot about that, but about Georgia, Phil mentioned. Yeah, about that experiment which happened in Georgia in 2000s during the Saakashvili time, and maybe somehow continued later. What I think that was a dramatic experiment which showed us that a group of historians, a group of creators of new textbooks can use quite modern and quite effective approaches to represent the same story. Yeah, in a very positivistic style. Yeah, it was, the narrative remains very positivistic. The narrative remains in Georgia, remains very essentialistic, nationalistic, yeah, primordialist also. It's like, the history starts from the same first monkey, I don't know, till Mikhail Saakashvili, yeah, like in Azerbaijan or Armenia. Unfortunately, I think this experiment shows us that, our optimism may be too high. I'm not really so optimistic. I think that the history teachers at schools, this is a very conservative society in every country, not only in Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia. Yeah, and the changes in this sphere depends on a lot of questions. And let us also mention the social situation in the country. Yeah, they got a very small salaries. They do not have enough time to develop themselves. They do not have a lot of possibilities, you know, to travel, I don't know, to visit workshops, to visit different conferences, or I don't know, go through new trainers, I don't know, meet with trainers and what else. Yeah, so no chances. Yeah, it's quite a big amount of people. It's army of teachers, let's say. Yeah. And unfortunately, the government do not contribute a lot to change in this sphere. But the chance to elaborate and to let's say represent for all these people the new possibilities, the new approaches to narrate the history, we still have this chance. And I think when we talk about the civil society, we have to understand that these are a lot of very different people, a lot of very different organizations. Yeah, so we can collaborate with some of them and do not collaborate with others. Yeah, and there is a chance still. There is a chance to find quite creative people. Yeah, at schools, at the universities especially. Yeah, a lot of people who got the education outside of our countries. Yeah, and we see Mirkamran and Flora here. Yeah, for us it's like suddenly appeared people. Okay, so Phil already mentioned this. So we did a lot on research on the history textbook, but only both of us, and that's and now new people appeared. Yeah, and I think these are not only us. Yeah, so I'm also quite optimistic, but not so optimistic as Mirkamran. Yeah.
Just last comment. I'm also aware that it won't take a couple of years, but decades for making any change. But these decades, let's say 2 decades or 3 decades, can give positive result if there is political will. Without political will, it can even take more than 2 or 3 decades. So political will, I think, is the main pivotal change maker here. But otherwise, we'll have to build, and we'll have to kind of, so every drop of water, every person that we can bring to our side will be a positive change for us as individuals without any resources as civil society members. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Thank you all. We are Flora, you want the last 2 words?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Sergey was saying about civil society, because this is very important. Yes, there are many civil society organizations. There are different people with different characters. And it's sometimes it comes down to the human factor. You get along or you get along. You don't get along. But a bigger issue here, I think, and this should be a shout out to all the civil society organizations that are in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, that right now we are actually entering the point, and this is the second war is actually showing that unlike other regions in the world, we are still in the process of this war, and there is an existential threat not to one country or one community. This is an existential threat to South Caucasus in general. So at some point, all of these civil organizations have to put their disagreements or different sides alike, and we have to finally understand that at this point there has to be a united front, at least in the civil society, for one goal. Later on, all of the other issues can be break down further and analyzed, reanalyzed, retested. But the point is that there is one main goal for all of these 3 countries with all of their exclave situations, like be it Abkhazia, Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Nakhchivan. But the primary goal is to finally create a stability in the region, and for that we need each and every civil society organization to be loud, to be active, and to be engaged with one another. So, I mean, just as a final word.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you, Mirkamran. Thank you, Sergey. We are slightly out of time, so thank you for those who stayed with us all along. So thank you for ending on a optimistic note, I guess. Wouldn't say positive, but optimistic note. Certainly we started from World War II, Germany, France, and I think probably important point to see that the progress didn't happen as you all just mentioned in a year, right? So the ideas of challenging very nationalistic ethnicized history education in Europe were there in the beginning of 20th century, end of 19th as well. It took a World War II for them to gain some degree of legitimacy. And yet, if the ideas weren't there, yeah, so this even the change might not have been possible following World War II either. So I think in that sense, I share not the optimism, but need to continue working, to continue growing the community of people who challenge. Because once there is as we can build hopefully enough movement towards challenging the way we teach history and we think of narratives ourselves. But second, again, once there are political openings, then having or not having people behind an alternative to the very dogmatic version of history we have now, it can be a key to actually having a change or not. So thank you for overall engaging in this topic. Thank you specifically for today for the very interesting discussion, and we look forward to hearing from you more. And thank you to our audience, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, probably in August. We will announce. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.